Alrighty, thank you everybody. So I'm Patrick, and today I'm going to be talking to you about this mouthful of a title. I know there's a lot there, but hopefully there'll be something interesting and useful for you to take back. So just a little bit about me, a bit of background. I'm a security engineer at Intercom. We have a small security function at Intercom, around 10 people supporting a company of 500. So multidisciplinary team. We run all of our various internal programs, security programs, and then we also provide tooling and consulting resources to all the various engineering and non-engineering teams at Intercom. And we have offices in multiple places, but we're primarily based out of the Dublin and San Francisco offices that contain the largest engineering teams. So for people who might not be familiar with Intercom, Intercom's a communications platform that businesses use to communicate with their customers. You might already be familiar with Intercom, having used it before. The most common way that people integrate is the messenger. So you can see it here in the bottom right of the screen, and then open on the right-hand side. And so this is the primary means by which our customers, who are themselves businesses, take our messenger, put it in their website, and then use it as a communications medium to go back and forth with their customers, either allow inbound queries or kind of direct targeted outbound messaging. So they say at the beginning of every talk you should have some sort of agenda or something, and I thought that was a little bit stodgy, so I decided I would do it in the form of a clickbaity headline. So you'll never guess how this startup reduced access to customer data by over 70%. Oof. I'm glad I'm in security and not a copywriter. And the premise for this talk is, as we began this work about a year ago, it became apparent to us, asking around friendly security teams, that there was a kind of an open secret at startups, which is that the industry waits many, many years until companies are quite old before they create any sort of meaningful access controls about how their employees deal with customer data. And this is kind of terrifying, especially because more and more we're dealing with an industry that has a lot of third-party SaaS vendors for like critical components. And so, you know, the dependencies here of like your CI dependency, your CI provider relies on an open source, database hosted platform, and they don't have internal access controls on their data. And so then your CI provider gets popped, and like there's a lot of chain of complicated dependencies there that makes this risky. And so I started asking around friends why they thought this was the case, and many of them reported back the same categories of issues, social and technical, as with every security problem. And the first was that access controls are something that's very, very hard to advocate for internally, especially when you're really young, and the business needs to create this external show of progress. And so, you know, ACLs don't move the needle for customers, especially not small ones. And so it's not prioritized in this like get stuff out the door, ship a new feature every 2 weeks or whatever it is, you know, race against competitors. And then also there's just like inherent problems at doing this at small companies. If anybody's ever worked at like 5, 10, 20, 40 people companies, everybody's a generalist, everybody's doing everything. So in an environment where you even have roles and you're, you know, divvying them out to people over any substantial period of time, 6, 9 months, you're just going to end up back at a situation where everybody has everything because they needed it to do their job. And so roles are effectively meaningless in an organization where everybody does everything. And then on the technical side, there was also some pretty strong reasons why people find it was hard to do this. There's just like not a great set of default tooling that people can look to when they want to tackle this problem. So in the common development frameworks that people are using, there's just no standard pattern. I'm a big fan of convention over configuration to just make it really easy to make a solid decision. And this is something where there isn't great tooling. So Django has some of this with the admin interface, but that's just really a very coarse, you know, God mode. You get read-write access to all of your global data sets. And what we're really talking about here is the ability to give scoped access to subsections of the data. And then for in instances where you're dealing with tools that you purchase, third-party tools, oftentimes they reserve their single sign-on and provisioning functionality for their more enterprisey customers. Really, the association of single sign-on and enterprisey, I think, is an unfortunate thing in our industry because it gives, basically, it just sets up this financial paywall for security features, which I think is unfortunate. And so they can't avail these because there's, you know, financial incentive for them to not do so because it might cost up to like twice as much per head just to get this feature. So not that I think that anybody in the audience needs to have like this drilled into them as to why it's important, but I just wanted to give a bit of context as to what we were thinking when we started this. the reality of technology is that no matter how much work we do to create great mechanisms and policies and auditing, there's always going to be a user, and users can err. And so we should make resilient systems. And then also we'd been burned by this in the past. So these are 3 incidents that I can call to mind where the lack of internal access controls significantly affected the scope of the breach. And so it was something that we were very cognizant of, having been on the receiving end of this. So, you can't really do any large, substantial body of work without a plan, or at least if you do, you're flying by the seat of your pants. So one of the early things that you'll do if you want to tackle this is create a plan. And usually at the start of most security teams, somebody sits down and writes out a set of policies. Pretty minimal set of policies, but one of them, and they're important just to set context of your work and communicate it to the rest of the company. And one of these will probably be a data classification standard. And it's a very, very simple document. It's just a list of all of the types of information that you have and you process, and then kind of aspirational goals and levels of protection and standards about how you want that data to be handled. And it's important that the labels that you choose here are kind of that the internal taxonomy that you use is very clear and well communicated to all the people in your organization for 2 reasons. A, you want people who are dealing with data to be able to properly classify it and understand what they need to be doing with it. And then secondly, as a result of that, if they properly classify it, then your security team can direct their attention to the resources with greatest need. So if you do this, you'll end up probably with something like this. So here on the left-hand side, we have our set of classifications. So from most to least sensitive. And on the right-hand side, you have the usual culprits of where you might find this data. And it's around these that we're going to try and create some concept of roles and figure out how to govern access to all of this. So in our case, we have 2 that we really, really care about. You might not have 2, you might only have 1 here, but critical and sensitive are the 2 most sensitive pieces of data that we have. Critical is, and this is confusing because Intercom is a business that businesses purchase software from and services. So critical is all of the data that our customers, businesses bring into Intercom or generate through their use of the product. So it's all of their user profiles. It's all of the conversations that they have. It's all of the data that they view and manipulate within Intercom. And then sensitive is all of that except it's ours. So it's all the conversations that we have with our customers, all the information that we know about them. And we split these out very carefully because we are very careful about what we do with the critical data. Like one of the reasons that we undertook this work was to have a really, really good trust story that we could give to our customers. And so we don't just lump ourselves in with customers, we treat them even better than we treat ourselves. And then private is pretty much everything else in our daily work. So like Slack, GitHub, Google Docs, all that sort of stuff. And then public is obviously everything that we publish, all of our podcasts, our books, our blog posts. And then on the right-hand side, we've got sources. So application and analytics data stores were the big pools of this critical data. And these are the usual things, SQL databases, caches, message queues, S3 buckets, all of these places that are kind of specifically designed to store and process a huge amount of data. And so from this, we kind of examined all of the roles and people working across Intercom, and basically distilled it down into these 2 major groups. There are other people in Intercom who need access to some amount of data, but these are the 2 that we wanted to focus on because they were by far the biggest. So the first is all of the engineering team. So at the time that we started this work, everybody who joined engineering team at Intercom was provisioned a base set of accesses. And one of them was production infrastructure access for a bunch of reasons I'll get into later. And the second is our customer support and sales teams. So the customer support and sales teams use an internal administrative interface that we build, and they use it to do a myriad of things like debug customer issues, provide them support, resolve any problems that people might be writing in about. And the tools are developed alongside our customer-facing product, but they're only accessible to us through a specific separate interface with a separate authentication mechanism, usual things. Typical for startups to have like admin dot or /admin somewhere in their application. And given the combined size of these 2 teams, this is the largest body of people within Intercom that was using data regularly. So one of the first things I want to call out is that at the start of this work, we decided it was very important to be able to quantify it and measure it. And so we set about creating a nice Datadog dashboard, which unfortunately, because it has like a bunch of literal numbers that I don't want to disclose, I can't show it. But basically, that which gets measured gets done. And it was really, really useful for us to be able to quantify daily and weekly work. So we work in 6-week cycles with weekly commits on how that work progresses over time within Intercom. And so the idea was that if we had this number that we were trying to reduce, we would get a little bit more creative taking weekly commits. We would say like, okay, I'm just going to reduce this number by 20%. I don't care how. I don't have a plan. I'm just going to do it. And so it was easier to think of this problem as, 50 small steps as opposed to trying to consider it in one large, sweeping change. And that was really, really important to kind of iterate on this over time because it's otherwise really, really daunting to take on a very large, seemingly intractable task. And so based on this, we decided to look at the engineering teams, and we had a suspicion that the access numbers here were pretty soft and that there was room for improvement. And sure enough, there was. So we have great data on this because we have a certificate authority for SSH certificates that enumerated everybody who had access. And so we were very quickly able to baseline everybody that didn't need it, and we also stopped automatic provisioning. So just to go into a little bit of detail as to why this access existed. Some of it is due to tech debt. So this broad access was needed to trigger things like migrations or start long-running data processing tasks in the background. And so by baselining, we immediately got 20% reduction. It was great. 20% of people that we don't have to worry about anymore. And the big takeaway is that, for us at least, was that we were reevaluating our understanding of what somebody needed to get their job done. And it turned out that over about a year and a half, that this wasn't actually a critical requirement of what you would need to get your work done. And it turns out that people are pretty happy to ask their colleagues to do something like this for them because it de-risks the situation for them. If you're like onboarding and you've just been there 2 weeks and you need to run a migration or set up some long-running task, it's much easier for you to ask your buddy who's onboarding you, like, hey, could you do that for me, rather than having to go through this big process. So, like I said, the next largest group of users were customer support and sales. And like I said, they're using this internal administrative dashboard, very similar to, I'm sure, what you have, all of you in your various companies. And there's a whole bunch of functionality in here, some very, very commonly used tools, and then also some tools that are specifically used by product teams to debug their service or their feature, and nobody else really uses them. And so going into this, we had a couple of rules of engagement because this was a very, very high traffic tool internally. This is something that people need to use like every hour, every day to get their job done. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't just kind of swooping in and sprinkling some access controls on it and completely destroying everybody's productivity, because that's not how you make friends. And we also were cognizant of the fact that we're only 10 people. We've got a company of 500. We're not in all the time zones that we operate in. And so we really, really didn't want the security team to be in this kind of central bottleneck position. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that grants were pretty granular and that they would expire by default so that we wouldn't end up in this position where just over 6-9 months, people would just get everything back. So the way we went about this was, we have a huge advantage here because we're deploying into our own software. We have liberty to change whatever we want and build in whatever arbitrary restrictions. So we were able to introduce some pretty robust access controls and auditing and other bells and whistles into kind of the base controller that's used for all these various pages. And then we have an internal pattern of very heavy use of static analysis checks in our code base to ensure what we call like coding practices. So one of them would be if you make a new admin tool extension, there'll be a static analysis check that makes sure that it inherits all this behavior. And so it allows us to develop pretty confidently going forward that even if people join the team and they make new tools, that they won't accidentally introduce some sort of data leakage. So I just want to take a detour into a little bit of a side quest, which is messy data. So before you can grant access or deny access to things, you have to first of all separate out what it is you want to protect and what it is you don't want to protect. And like I said, there was over 100, I think there was 120, 130 different resources within this tool. Some of them displayed critical information, some of them didn't. Some of them are used exclusively by one team or even one person. Some of them are used by everybody every day. And then on top of that, there's the fact that a lot of the data that we're processing, a lot of the data the models that we build have both critical and non-critical data co-located together. So if you think about it, in Intercom, we have a conversation model. It holds all of the channel and content information about how a conversation was conducted, who was in it, all of that. And there's clearly some metadata components there that are very important to us, like when an email notification was sent about a particular comment that was made in a conversation. And then there's the critical stuff, which is, the literal user identity and content of the message that they sent. And so we wanted to be very strict that we were separating these things out. And so we undertook kind of a boil the ocean classification, where we decided we would ruthlessly go through all these tools, and if there was any kind of unnecessary critical data being printed out, we would just redact it. And so we made a bunch of changes here. Some of them were minor, so changing away from using PII-based identifiers into just using foreign keys everywhere. Others were larger. So for some of the more commonly used tools that dealt with the more complex models, like the conversations model, we decided to just completely split them into critical and non-critical pages. So everybody would be able to get access to the non-critical stuff that they would need to debug, like why isn't an email sending, whereas the content would be in a completely separate page that barely anybody had access to. And so this was a non-trivial amount of work, but it was something that we only had to do once, and had the result of massively limiting the things that we had to protect. And so, just allowed us to focus a lot more. And then, again, we have another static analysis pattern that makes sure that any new additions get properly classified, so we can build upon these understandings and build kind of like generous access to all the non-critical stuff, because there's nothing to protect, without accidentally shooting ourselves in the foot. So from this 3-week period, we built up kind of an understanding of how people were using the tools, and it confirmed to us again that like the production infrastructure access, this number was also very soft, and that there was roughly 3 types of users. There was like the customer support and sales team that were just using everything, all the time, everything. Then there was the product teams, and they were using their like specific, check this feature tool. And then there was everybody else who was like sporadically using 1 or 2 pages. And so we decided to just kind of distill this all into creating like base grants for people. So we set out 3 different categories, or 3 different classes. There was all, which is just like blanket access to everything, kind of a super user. All without critical, which is all the pages that we don't care about. So you can view any amount of non-critical data in Intercom as an employee, because there's nothing that you're going to glean from it. And then the ability to just like individually grant access to pages. So this is useful for people that literally only need to use one thing and don't even need access to everything else. And so based on that, we decided to launch kind of in a fail open mode. So we evaluated it for 2 weeks. We descoped the customer support org by giving them a blanket access to start, because we wanted to come back and work with them specifically later, because they were by far the heaviest consumers of these tools. And even without the customer support team, there was still another 20% reduction. This was like a huge baseline, just cutting away access that people didn't need. And then in this 2-week period, based on like the kind of profiles that we built about people and the grants that we given them, we observed, I think, only 2 or 3 failures. And so by the time that we went live, we were extremely confident that we weren't going to massively like tank somebody's productivity, because that really was a nightmare scenario for us. We really don't want to get in the way of the teams that we're working with. And so this, this measured progress allowed us to be very confident in shipping these changes. But we also made sure that, we're not perfect. We knew that we were going to miss things. So we decided to build in a nice little break glass mechanism that would allow these teams to kind of self-regulate and allow people within the teams to gain temporary access grants. And it's pretty simple. Anytime you view a page that you're not allowed to view, you don't have permission already, you're presented a form, you fill it out, you give a reason like, what are you doing? Shows up in Slack. Turns out that between the security team and all the customer support managers around the world, we basically have followed the sun coverage of this room. You see the inline description. This URL brings you to a kind of a profile view of all the permissions that somebody already has active. And so it's easy for people who are making the grants to kind of understand whether this is appropriate or not and make a judgment call. And so this was really, really useful. From this, we had already gotten down into a position where people didn't have access to things that they didn't need. And if they did, they could get an access for a day or a week. And going back to how we plan work, if there was somebody who was working on a feature that needed them to require or get access to sensitive or critical data for a week, we could do that comfort or safe in the knowledge that they weren't going to kind of keep it after the period that they explicitly required it for. And so, like I said, we initially descoped customer support because we wanted to come back to work with them separately, because again, they were the highest volume user. And so we had this idea. So we had this initial, as we started out, we had this tool that was used very, very sparingly internally called impersonation. I'm sure different companies have different things like this, but basically it's a tool that allows an employee to view somebody's account through their eyes, basically. And this is useful for debugging things where our internal tools fail and we just can't figure out what the discrepancy is between what the customer is seeing and what we expect them to see. And it's really, really rarely used. The number of people who have access to it internally is very, very low. It's very, very tightly scoped and kept close. And the way it works, again, advantage in working in our own product, is that you basically ask a customer for permission in the context of the conversation and the issue you're dealing with. And once you have that permission, you can add a tag, this like specific permission to impersonate tag to the user that just gave you consent. And then using this conversation URL, you can individually address every conversation in Intercom with the URL. And the reason, you could use this as collateral to make another access grant internally to say like, hey, this user Patrick is having an issue. I need to log into their account to view like why they're hitting this particular exception in an area of the product that I can't reproduce. And then somebody can grant you that access and you get a temporary ability to log into their account. And again, like with all the other access grants, we collect a reason here. We summarize these on a quarterly, if not 6-month basis, and then we use it as a roadmap input to make sure that we're building better and better tooling to deprecate the need for these wide accesses. And so there's a neat trick in here, which is that, at least in Intercom, we have 2 kind of God objects that can scope the data that is associated with them. And so we decided that we would piggyback on this authentication mechanism and create a variant of the internal tools, the sensitive pages, that instead of showing you just like all of the data within Intercom, it would only show you the data that belonged to the user that just gave you permission. So once you escalated this access, you got access to the internal tools, and you could see like just the data that belongs to Patrick, just the data that belongs to his companies within Intercom. And the way that this is done is just basically there's a default method in each of these controllers that can swap out the scope, like the God level object scope. And this makes sure that even if you enter in like an object ID for something that doesn't belong to the user, you can't actually directly access it because it'll only find it through the view of what this user or what this app is able to view. And so this is really, really nice for us because people get to use the more powerful administration, like debugging tools, but only get access to the very, very limited amount of data that they need to do their job. And so how it works internally is if you're on customer support, you get access to all of the non-sensitive pages because there's nothing in there that we're worried about. And if you're a customer support manager and you've gone through an onboarding period of at least 4 weeks, you get all the above, plus the ability to use this feature and selectively give it to other people. And so this allowed us to create tools that were scoped. They were tightly scoped. They had a per user and per resource grants. They expired, but also created like this self-serve mechanism for the CS teams to be able to work on this themselves. And this is all automatically provisioned based on the HR system data that we take a snapshot of every day. And so when people either move off the team or move into some other role, this access gets cleared out so people don't keep access across the various jobs that they've had. So we have some future work planned for this to make it even better. So at the moment, the act of giving consent is in line within the conversation. And we review these, like the customer support team runs their own kind of quality assurance audits of conversations on a weekly basis, I think. But it's a little bit, it's not as tight as we want it to be. So what we want to do is push the literal act of granting permission onto the customer's side so that we can't do anything without their action. So this is a work in progress of what it might look like at the moment, but basically a customer will get the ability to selectively turn this on and off. And we won't be able to do anything without the customer having undertaken this action, and they're fully informed, they get to see it, they get to revoke it if they think the need is done. And so we want to be able to put customers in the position of controlling their own data. Like, again, one of the big reasons that we wanted to do this was to have a really good trust story for our customers to be able to understand what was going to happen when they started using Intercom and where their data would be. And now they are in control. So this is something that we hope to launch in the next couple of weeks. So the end results over 70% of people no longer have access to employee data, or of employees no longer have access to critical data internally, which is a huge, relief and weight off our shoulders. We have self-service tools that allow the teams that really need to kind of operate their own systems. They change the way that they work based on the volume of work that they need to do, and so there was no way that we were going to be able to come in from afar and be like, this is how you need to work. The security team has decided, in all of its infinite wisdom, that you can only do these things, and that generally doesn't go down so well. And then we have this customer-based consent mechanism that allows customers to be in control of this. So it's no longer something that they have to trust us on. They can just literally use the tools themselves. So the lessons that I kind of got out of this, and I'd love for you guys to bring home or to think about a little bit more, is that your access numbers today are totally soft. They're big, they're daunting, but there's just so much low-hanging fruit in there that you'd be amazed at what you could do by just giving it a week or two worth of consideration. Collecting intention at the point of authorization is super useful. I cannot stress the benefit of having this as roadmap inputs for your tools. So the impersonation features that we have are very broad and actually a little bit cumbersome, and people don't want to use them because the debugging tools are better. So if we can push people into the debugging tools by making them even better, we get to deprecate this means of access entirely. And then also pairing with your high value or high volume internal customers pays off wonders. We were really fortunate in that the customer support team leaned into this process with us, and the results that we got were far better than anything that we would have been able to do on our own. So that's all I have today. Thanks for listening. If people have any questions, I'll be here, and you can also reach out to me on Twitter, or you can spam my email. That's it.